Mr. Murphy, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your testimony here today. I want to get back to this question that we've been tossing around about metrics. And as compelling as data is about the number of roads paved and the number of children educated, it strikes me that that's ultimately not why we're there. If just investments in social infrastructure and in hard infrastructure were our end product here, then we should be in a lot of places in the world. The metric here ultimately is, to Mr. Quigley's point, is whether or not we are creating the conditions upon which people will feel better about the United States and feel less inclined to move into an extremist movement there that threatens both the stability of the country and threatens the United States. And so I guess my question is, how do you think about how we measure that? And what are the ways in which we can do it? I agree, it's hard to do that on a national basis because we've got a lot of other competing factors that are hard to measure for. But I wonder if there are ways to do that on a localized basis in areas of the country that we have heavy investments in and where we are paving roads and putting kids to school and setting up health clinics. Is there a way to measure what the sentiment there is to the United States and what the local activity of extremist groups are in those areas? I'd be interested to hear a little bit about how we measure what is our ultimate objective rather than our intermediary objective of making the investments and making them stick.
On the more macro picture, the combating extremism is obviously a core reason, if not the core reason, for part of our assistance programs that's laid out again in our regional stabilization strategy, and in fact the kind of central focus of the president's speech on Afghanistan and Pakistan on December 1st. So clearly, how successful we are in ultimately combating extremism is critical to this. The metrics in terms of actually gauging and evaluating that are obviously a lot more difficult. I mean, it is something that's part of every conversation. There are more specific aspects that we attempt to use in combating extremism. The new public diplomacy and counter-propaganda programs that we've had and trying to get out more moderate voices more frequently. But in terms of actually how we gauge the moderating impact or even whether we'll have access to that information, and certainly not yet. I think at this point it's a far longer term process, is one that we're continuing to evaluate how we best capture that information. In the relative short term, the outputs are the easiest gauge, but clearly they don't tell the whole story as well. And we have to say not only how many schools are built, but how they're then used and what the sustainability is, and ultimately what the literacy rate in that region is. And so it's a constant process of adjusting that as we get the information and over the course of time. But with the ultimate goal, the combating extremism is certainly a core piece of that. I don't know, Jim, had more specifics.
Very good questions. I would just add that in the end, one of the metrics I kind of keep in my mind is the continuity and the strength of the civilian government and the existence of the civilian-led government in Pakistan. It's an indicator to me of their satisfaction with a civilian-elected and a civilian-led government because of the, as you know, the rotations over time of civilian government versus military government, and strengthening that relationship between the people. As I said earlier, the governed and the governing is extremely important. And I think we'll see indicators of that in the coming months in Pakistan, because they are now going through, in each province, decisions by each provincial assembly as to how they will hold their own local elections, their equivalent of district or NAZM, used to be called NAZM elections. That, I think, will be, you asked at the local level, an indicator of what are the people thinking about the way that Pakistan government is moving forward in servicing its people. And it'll be a mixed story. I am absolutely sure it'll be a mixed message To me, rule of law is extremely important in how they perceive rule of law at the local level, how they perceive corruption by local officials or not at the local level, and how they perceive delivery of services and their demand for those services at the local level.
I understand how difficult this is, and I understand even when you're talking about local measurements like election results, it's very difficult to extrapolate that simply to U.S. aid versus a lot of other factors. But to the extent, Mr. Feldman, you were talking about the White House's new effort to try to implement metric strategies, I think to the extent that we can try to get at our end goal and in some way measure that back to where we have made investments and where we haven't, it makes it a lot more helpful for those of us who right now are operating on faith and who believe this is the right strategy to go back and translate that to our constituents back home that are sometimes skeptical of us spending this amount of money abroad instead of here at home. So I'd encourage you to continue to think about how to best measure that.
Thank you, Mr. Murphy. Mr. Lynch, you recognize for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank both of our witnesses for your help with the committee's work. We were Okay. We were in Pakistan several weeks ago, meeting with some of the USAID and some of our NGOs there, and there was some concern raised about the focus is right, I think, in terms of the federally administered tribal areas in the Northwest province. However, there was some concern about the safety of NGO personnel in some of those regions, and there was a sort of a reassessment going on, I guess you could call it, where Western employees were sort of hunkering down in areas closer into Islamabad and trying to get services out to the population in those areas through Pakistani nationals. And it was a sort of a they were changing it on the fly, and there were even sustained concerns about the safety of those Pakistani nationals doing work on our behalf or on behalf of the Pakistani people. And I was just trying to get a sense of how much is that affecting the efficacy of our attempts here to bring capacity to those governments in the tribal areas in the Northwest Frontier Province?
I appreciate your question, Congressman Lynch. It's one on our minds all the time. It's our preeminent concern, frankly. And we have, in both in Afghanistan and Pakistan, we've lost a lot of people paid under our assistance programs. More, of course, in Afghanistan than in Pakistan, and the local nationals, in this case Pakistanis, are the ones who are most exposed. We know I mean, the head of CHF was murdered in Peshawar a year ago, along with one of his Pakistani staff. There have been kidnappings of staff from our NGOs. So,
sir, could I ask you to just speak up a little bit? I'm an old iron worker, and I have bad hearing.
What we've tried to do now, and since the time you were there, is whenever any of our partners come to us, and it's usually at their initiative, to say, will we provide funding to them so they can adjust their agreements, their contract or their grant or their cooperative agreement, as we call it, to allow some expenses to improve their security. We look at that very seriously and make sure, in consultation with our security office, regional diplomatic security people at the embassy, that we come to a mutually agreeable accommodation so that, in fact, they can try to improve their security. We also have to count on the Pakistani security services themselves to assist us with the right kind of information about areas where these people work and where they have to go into, and come back and commute back and forth. So we have done that kind of coordination since the time that you were there and raised some of these concerns and were responsive to them. So it has not stopped us from being able to operate and to be able to support FATA Secretariat and others, for example, or even in the Northwest Frontier. But it is certainly something that constrains us on any given day.
Okay. All right. I'm just about out of time. Actually, Mr. Feldman, would you like to add to that, please?
I completely agree with what Jim said. I mean, it's a constant calibration between obviously having to be mindful of the security situation and wanting to protect lives while also trying to do the critical assistance work that we continue to do in those areas. I would give as a recent example, the U.S. Has agreed to provide $55 million for reconstruction projects in South Waziristan focused on roads, dams, rehabilitation, and power grid. And General Zubair has worked very closely with Ambassador Rafel and our embassy in Islamabad to ensure that access for U.S.-funded Pakistani monitors would be one of their top priorities. And so as we continue to try to push forward, and there's a range of other oversight mechanisms we've tried to put in place in that, which I'm happy to talk about later, fixed reimbursement agreements and things like this. But we have tried to work with and mitigate to the extent we can the security situation while still while still being very cautious about risking lives.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Lynch.
Chairman.
Mr. Van Hollen, you recognize for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you both for your service. And I want to commend you and the whole team on what I think has been significant progress over the last year or so in Pakistan. And I think we're beginning to see the results, at least with respect to responsiveness and engagement of the government of Pakistan in fighting the most extreme elements. It wasn't long ago that President Musharraf was entering into non-aggression pacts with the Pakistani Taliban in Swat Valley, largely as a result of the change in government and the engagement of the new administration, a diplomatic, political, economic offensive. You have a much greater degree of cooperation and engagement. Not only has the military gone after the Pakistani Taliban, but they've also taken very important steps in going after elements of the Afghan Taliban based in Pakistan. We saw that obviously with the arrest of Mullah Omar's operational head and the arrest of the shadow governors and other signs of greater cooperation. And that is a result, I believe, of greater confidence and cooperation between the U.S. government and the Pakistani government, and a view on the Pakistani side that they have a big stake as well in defeating extremism, whether it's the Pakistani Taliban or ultimately trying to resolve the situation with the Afghan Taliban. So I think that that is important progress, and I think it's the result, in part, of engagement at all levels, including economic engagement, and sending the signal that we are there for the longer term. And I commend you on the idea of trying to channel more resources through Pakistani contractors and indigenous institutions, with the caveat, of course, and you've raised this, that we have to make sure there's transparency and accountability. As we put more funds through local organizations and build capacity, we need to make sure that those monies are being well spent. Now, on the other side, so there's building this relationship with the government, but we're all frustrated with the fact that if you take a poll in Pakistan today, among the Pakistani people, the United States is held in very low regard. And as the chairman pointed out, what was a very good thing, the Kerry Lugar Burman legislation aid, it was like kicking the gift horse in the mouth. Although we don't see it as a gift, we see it as part of our engagement and interest. At the same time, it was something that was a good thing. So while I like the idea of channeling more funds and building capacity, at the same time, those American taxpayer dollars are not necessarily, we don't get the credit necessarily for those investments in the mind of the Pakistani people. And I think there's a real feeling that while we pumped millions and millions of dollars into important things like institution building and democratic building, that if you were to turn around and ask the average Pakistani citizen, what has the United States done in terms of economic development, it's hard for them to identify something. So my question is, in addition to doing these kind of things, should we not also think of doing some of the things we used to do in the past? USAID used to do much bigger investments that were important investments in the country, but at the same time drew the national attention of the Pakistani people, clearly identified as an investment being made by the United States in the future of Pakistan and the future relationship, because there is a concern that after spending all this money, especially as you channel it more through the government of Pakistan, which builds capacity, that no one in Pakistan among the Pakistani population can say, well, yeah, the United States helped us in this particular concrete way. If you could respond to that and what ideas you have with respect to some of these other projects.
Congressman, we certainly agree with your comments. It's important that the Pakistani people have some visibility and see the benefits of cooperation with the American people and the American assistance program with our people's money. So we are looking and have already initiated the first wave in the last few months of assistance to the energy sector, trying to rehabilitate and repair some of their existing power systems. They will see that to the extent they see things quickly in the press. They should also see it in terms of the effects in certain parts of the country on their load shedding. Now, again, these are just the first steps. It's a country of 175 million people, plus or minus. It's more than half the population of our country. So when you take that, even with a very generous assistance program we have now, it's still less than $8 or $9 per capita in the country. So we have to do this extremely catalytically, and we have to be very thoughtful on how we approach this. So we'll be working in energy, which all Pakistanis can immediately identify with as a need. We'll be working in water, which is an extremely important feature for the Pakistanis, both in agriculture, in quality of water, potable water in their communities, but also in water distribution systems, and obviously because of Indus Basin Treaty concerns that are also political concerns in the country. So those are just some quick examples, but we want to make sure as we do those more infrastructure programs that the policy reforms are there too, so that our people's money is put into programs that in fact will be sustainable financially, and those are the two examples I'd like to share with you.
Thanks, Congressman Van Hollen. I appreciate your stage setting as well, because I think it is critical as we think about how we continue to move forward, what the metrics are, recognizing that there's still a sense of great skepticism about the American relationship among Pakistanis, that just a year ago the Taliban were 100 miles from Islamabad. I mean, we were facing a quite critical scenario, and that over the course of the past year, through the increased cooperation at every level of government, we have seen the development of a far more cooperative, constructive, civilian-based relationship, which I think is starting to yield real benefits now, but it will take, I think, a significant amount of time to continue to see these benefits, as per the earlier questions about how do you actually gauge something like combating extremism. Your question on how these benefits help to accrue to the U.S., how people help to how people focus on what the U.S. has contributed to them in our development projects. It's obviously one that the development community grapples with all the time. And as we came to it in terms of looking at how we could best use this Kerry Lugar-Berman money, we also went through the exact same calculus, and we really tried to walk the line between continuing to do the institutional capacity building as we've done over time, but also demonstrate, and this is where this whole term of either signature projects or high impact, high visibility projects has come from, but to do at least one type of those projects in each of the 5 or 6 main sectors we've identified that are most important to Pakistanis, starting with energy, given the Secretary's trip last fall, and the second one being water, showing that we're hearing the concerns of the Pakistani people beyond just the border regions, beyond where we're seen to have a more narrow targeted interest. And I think the process that evolved as we considered what we could do in the energy field was a very instructive one. I think we started with the idea of let's build something big that we can stand on and have a ribbon cutting, and everyone will know that that America built this. And as we looked more and more into it, first of all, the costs were exorbitant. The sustainability issues were there. It was questionable what the needs were. And as we started looking more at the actual needs, it became far more clear that working on the efficiency issues, working on getting more watts on the grid, avoiding some of the blackouts in high consumer and commercial areas, which we could do relatively quickly and easily through this $125 million tube well project, would be far more constructive, far more efficient, and more sustainable. And so instead of the kind of signature energy project, a dam or something like that, we have come up with this signature energy initiative. And I think that the same process is unfolding in many of the other sectors. In education, we could have looked at building an American university. But again, how sustainable is that over the long term? What's the commitment there? Does that become a target in and of itself? And so I think, although we're still very much in the process of trying to determine which direction we're going, and Post and USAID and State together are actively looking at a number of these projects in the remaining sectors, something like a center of excellence at an existing university or some sort of faculty, which would be seen as this is a gift of the American people, or done in conjunction, cooperation with the American people, helps to build that, but is also not necessarily the grand bricks and mortar vision that we had of big development projects in the 60s and 70s.
Thank you, Mr. Feldman. Mr. Welch, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank you very much. You know, the dilemma I think all of us have is, number one, what's the basic purpose of the aid? And it has to be tied, obviously, to national security, however else we describe it. And number two, in order to deliver that aid, how can it be effective? How can we get our money's worth? And the models that we've used, whether it was depending on international contractors and NGOs where there's a high overhead, whether it's dependent on Pakistani ministries where there's a high level of corruption, and whether it's dependent on NGOs where there's huge oversight problems. The only way we can be successful, and I'll just ask you this, is whether we have, Mr. Beaver, an honest and a competent Pakistani partner. I mean, would you agree with that?
Absolutely.
So if we don't, I mean, there's disputes between the military and the civilian government. There's a weak civilian government that's up and down. Other than for purposes of domestic consumption and the need that we have to at least appear that we're attempting to win hearts and minds through development projects, through economic opportunity projects, through education projects. If we are honest with ourselves and ask the hard question, can we realistically be successful when the implementation and execution really requires an honest partner in Pakistan?
Well, this is one of the purposes of our financial pre-award assessments. It's our procurement officers, it's our controllers, it's our project officers also that check out these organizations before we provide assistance to them.
It's a real dilemma. I don't mean to be challenging, because I know you're doing your level best, and obviously it's desirable for us to be doing projects that are going to improve the lives of Pakistani people. But there is a hard question that we have to ask. We can have all the auditors in the world. We can have all of the honest NGOs in the world. But if there's not a mechanism that is solid in Pakistan, we're going to have Iraq all over again. I mean, that's the hard question. And what you seem to be acknowledging is that we really do need an honest partner there. Mr. Feldman, how about you?
Of course, I absolutely agree that we need an honest partner. We're doing everything that we can to work with the honest partners, to identify those, to vet them, and to make sure.
And politeness requires that we say kind things, but the mechanisms over there don't exist. It's our need now because we have an urgent national security need. Things have changed, apparently somewhat for the better, as Mr. Van Hollen has mentioned. But I think most of us would probably come to the conclusion that it had much more to do with a self-interested conclusion made by the Pakistani military that the Afghan Taliban, or the Pakistani Taliban, were starting to cause trouble that made their lives difficult. It was not a result of the Kerry Lugar aid. I mean, would you agree with that?
I think it's a combination of factors. I think that it's an evolving, changing relationship that's dependent on many things, and I think that the Kerry Berman aid will be quite critical for that.
Well, when I was there, I mean, I was there with the chairman, and what was really apparent when you're there is how incredibly difficult it is to actually get a water project, an education project, you name it, how hard it is to actually do it. And we can talk here and we can talk about metrics, but there's an abstract quality to it because the people on the ground, the security challenges they face, the lack of infrastructure, administrative infrastructure to make it happen, these are enormous impediments to the best intention, the best and hardest working people. And, you know, for domestic reasons here, we have to act beyond military. But on the other hand, with all of the practical problems, I wonder whether it doesn't make sense to do a big visible project, somewhat like the approach described by Mr. Van Hollen. It's easier to control the money, more confidence that you'll get a dollar's worth of, well, maybe 70 cents worth of work for a dollar's worth of income. And it is a substantial and visible project. I mean, maybe I know my time's up, ask each of you to briefly comment on that.
I would just comment that in my experience with Pakistan over a quarter of a century and half my career, there are leaders in Pakistan, there are reformers in Pakistan,
right.
There are many Pakistanis of very high integrity, such high integrity that sometimes in past governments they could not be trusted and they were sidelined. And some of them are back, and there is a growing, I think, appreciation by the Pakistani business community and Pakistani civil society that they have to take more charge at their levels for the future of their country and to hold their leaders as accountable as we hold our leaders accountable. And I think that's a very important phenomenon that's evolving in Pakistan today, and obviously the extremist threats to the country's future helped to mobilize that, whether it was attacks on universities or police stations in Lahore, regardless of those things that were going on in the Fatah and the NWFP. And I think the real future of that country and our assistance to it is linked to our ability to support those who have the courage inside their own society to transform their own society. And that's where we will be most effective. And over the long run, getting to Congressman Van Hollen's question also, that's where the Pakistani people will thank the American people the most, but it'll take time.
Thank you, Mr. Welch. Mr. Drejos, you recognize for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen, for being here today. I just wanted to follow up on Mr. Van Hollen's comments about Pakistani perception of U.S. aid in Pakistan. I'm a former Peace Corps volunteer, and I'm curious as to how we are engaging in soft diplomacy. There are many projects, massive projects, littered around developing countries that were done counter to the will of the people in certain countries that because of one reason or another were failures, and they stand out as failures of U.S. aid policy in those countries. Yet we know that soft diplomacy often works very effectively in terms of changing opinion toward the United States of folks that are obviously living in those countries. So I was wondering just if you could start off by telling me what we're doing to engage in soft diplomacy in Pakistan.
I guess Congressman, first of all, I would say it'll depend in part how we define soft diplomacy. But in terms of if it also includes democracy and governance-related activities, whether it's just person-to-person contacts, which is going to be part of one of the key areas for the strategic dialogue next week, and continuing to build those ties with NGOs, obviously continuing to build ties with both federal and provincial leaders, parliamentarians, and other elected leaders. The Democracy and Governance Program, and Jim can give more details, has a parliamentary strengthening dimension to it, a local governance dimension to it, an elections-based dimension to it. I know that NDI and IRI and other organizations are very interested in continuing to do more. There's a whole range of, on the softer diplomacy, there's a whole range of kind of communications mechanisms. Our new Undersecretary of Public Diplomacy, Judith McHale, has put together a very robust communications strategy, which has already started putting out bids for children's educational TV programs in local languages, other communications programming, radio, television, using new social media networks, cell phones, and other things. So there are a range of activities that are currently in the works and starting to be implemented. But I'm happy to come back and.
Well, I guess I'm concerned that those all seem to be up here. And what are we doing at the ground level in the villages, in the cities, in terms of touching people, face to face, in terms of Americans on the ground, and engaging in some type of cultural exchange in addition to development. Because that when we talk about democratization, when we talk about federal government intervention with the Pakistani government, that's a bit different than being at the village level and on the ground.
Yeah. If I could just add, Congressman, one of the evolutions you will see this year in our program, security permitting, will be deepening our depth, deepening our presence in the country. We will be moving out of just Islamabad. I'm talking about AID, and establishing regional offices in Lahore to service the people of Punjab, in Karachi to service the people of the Sindh and Baluchistan. In addition to a very modest presence in Peshawar, which is constrained right now for American officers by security. And that will enable American officers, again, I'm talking AID, and sadly we don't have a Peace Corps presence there, to be able to get out with the people more, with the business community, with the local associations, with women's groups, with communities, with the governors and the district officials, the kinds of things we used to be able to do 25 years ago when I first served there, and that we've all been wanting to do. And that's why we'll be basically tripling over time, over the next 2 fiscal years, assuming funds are available, our American officer presence. But we're also going to be more than doubling our Foreign Service National Pakistani staff to also serve in Lahore and in Karachi and be able to help us get out more as well.
With regard to the AID assistance delivery and the transference to local NGOs, what lessons have we learned in terms of accountability and sustainability in terms of Pakistani NGOs and how they're able to engage in development? And do we have outcomes measurements that we're using to hold them accountable, similar to what we would be doing with international NGOs and American NGOs operating with USAID contracts?
A number of questions in your larger question there.
It's a clever tactic Mr. Dreyhouse uses to eat up his 30 seconds that were remaining. But please, go ahead and respond.
First and foremost, we do have to assess the capability of these groups. We have to make sure they're actually registered with their own government, that our financial analysis and those of our Pakistani firms that we use assure that, in fact, they're following their own law first to make sure they're accountable. We also have learned some lessons about how we do our grants, because you're talking NGOs, they're usually grants. So we don't necessarily always give it all in one big amount of money up front. We tend to give an initial amount, see how they do, give an incremental amount, see how they do, and then give a final amount. Those kinds of things to meter the flow of money to make sure we get the performance that they told us they want to do, and we are assisting them in what they claim they are good at. That's why we provide grants or cooperative agreements. In the case of cooperative agreements, we have a clause that's called substantial involvement. It means the U.S. government has a much deeper relationship with the grantee than under a normal grant arrangement. And we exercise that through our assistance officers that have federal warrants. So those are just some examples. In terms of measurement, every one of our program activities has to have a measurement and monitoring plan, and that we make that available to the Inspector General to hold us accountable in the way we do our business as well. Those are some of the lessons we've learned over time, Congressman.
May I just add one thing to it? I mean, one thing which I think you're very right to focus on is the impact on the ground. But in an example like SWAT, just since September, the combination of the work of the Pakistani government in helping to return IDPs, but also the U.S. aid work has really contributed to a resumption of normalcy there, which I think would have been unimaginable 6 months ago. So helping to rebuild government Pakistan offices, helping to rebuild schools, helping to and thereby enabling people to return and resume that degree of stability, I think has been very significant from both a national security strategic sense as well as what our overall development goals are.
If I could just add, we also vet our partners. We are required to check to make sure that the partners that we provide assistance to are not on certain terrorist lists. We make sure that our partner organizations are in good stead with their own government from a financial perspective in their own, whether they pay taxes or whatever their particular rules are. And we're particularly mindful of what was called the Negroponte guidance from the last administration, which basically asks us to assess the risk in each of our partners and to adjust our controls depending upon the risk we assess with that particular partner in that particular geographic area from the point of view of the money going to hands to whom it should not go.
Thank you very much. Ms. Chu, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, last week, militants stormed the northern Pakistani offices of the World Vision and killed 6 workers, injuring 5. It is the world's largest Christian charity and works in some of the poorest and most politically unstable places on earth, and also educates and employs local women. All these factors make it a target for extremists. So what my question is, considering this situation, what implications does this have for Pakistani NGOs that receive aid, and what about their safety and security?
Certainly, we condemn the actions on World Vision, and we're very, very sorry and troubled to have seen that incident. But it's unfortunately not uncommon for NGOs and others doing this type of work to be targeted. We are continuing to work, as we've discussed here today, within the constraints that we have, to walk that fine line between continuing the very important assistance work, the work focused on women's issues and some of the other things that World Vision was doing in the neediest areas with the security concerns. And so I know Jim can talk a little bit more about the kind of security mechanisms that we try to put in place or try to work through in the most conflict-ridden areas. But it's a as I've said, it's a constant calibration that Post tries to work through in terms of where we will continue to target our work, to target our resources, to try to continue the assistance work while also being as cognizant about the real risks that people are facing and trying not to put them directly into harm's way.
I would just add that wherever, in this case, World Vision, they were not a direct recipient of USAID, but where they are, we have urged our partners to come to us and say, if you perceive security risks, please describe them to us. Tell us what you feel you need for your people while they're traveling, if it's the kind of vehicles they travel in, if it's the protection around where their offices are. Those are things we can help with financially as part of a grant or cooperative agreement or contract. And we've had a lot of experience in this, but they do have to take some initiative to come to us if they perceive problems. But we're not being just passive that way. We've also reached out to them. I met with every chief of party that of every contractor, grantee, and implementing partner in Pakistan when I was there in the fall. And I will be going out again soon. I will meet with them again. And one of the things we did talk about was security. Again, these were ones we support because they, however, are in close touch with others who we don't support, and they share information. And we've told them anyone who particularly is U.S. registered are welcome to come to, I think it's now a monthly briefing with the diplomatic security officers, and USAID has our own security officers at the post in Islamabad, where they share information, they hear about those concerns, they get advice, and there are ways to sort of establish best practices because their own network is faster and better even than ours, frankly. And there are other techniques that could be used, but this is not the appropriate forum to discuss that. But we could discuss it offline if you'd like. Thank you.
Just as a follow-up, that I know that many of the attacks have targeted local Muslim women who were involved with American aid organizations. Is there a way to balance the safety of these women involved in these programs without compromising our goal of advancing the rights of women and girls in Pakistan?
Well, obviously we encourage women's groups or women to participate in all the programs of our assistance. It's first and foremost the responsibility of Pakistani security entities to protect their citizens. That said, there are some things, for example, in schooling and education that we have learned that if schools need walls built around them to protect the children, including the girls, that is a very legitimate thing for us to do with the American people's money, since we want the education to happen and we want more girls in particular to participate in the education system. That's a simple thing, very simple, that in fact does make a big difference. Another, frankly, is training female teachers. The more that there are female teachers in the country, the more families are willing to allow their daughters to go to school, because they feel that the teachers will be more responsive to them and less of a possible personal security threat to them. These are things Pakistanis have told us, lessons they've learned that we want to be able to help support.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. We've finished our first round of questioning. With your indulgence, I'm going to see if the members want a question or two more before we fold here today. But I'm going to start that. Mr. Flake is deferred, and I appreciate that. But Mr. Beaver, you know we concentrate a lot in this committee on the personnel over there and the ramping up of U.S. personnel. Many of us have the impression that we were hollowed out over a period of time, and now we've got to get our capacity back. So if we're decentralizing, we're going to smaller, predominantly Pakistani contracts that need oversight from people in our USAID. What's the recruitment process that we have to get people in, and how's that going? What our numbers look like? What's the training process that we get them up to the capacity that they can actually supervise and manage other people as opposed to just do certain functions? And I think lastly that leads to a question that was discussed a little bit beforehand. What, if any, legal authorities does USAID need in order to do that recruitment training and the retention of sufficient numbers of personnel for service in Pakistan?
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, if one looked at, say, contracts officers or procurement professionals, for example, we now have about a half a dozen in Islamabad. These are U.S. contracts and agreements officers, not to mention Pakistani. We expect to expand those procurement officials in country over the coming year, probably doubling them. We expect to move them out into the local area, into Lahore and Karachi as well, to help oversee our projects as we get.
So you'll have
deeper.
a total of 12 in the entire country?
It'll be Approximately 12, as I understand it.
So those 12 people will essentially do all of the procurement or overseeing all of the procurement?
They also have Pakistani negotiating assistants and others that have experience doing this with World Bank or ADB or others from whom we've hired some of these staff to be able to help us. And we bring in...
But they want to be able, you want those people, the procurement office, to be able to know whether or not the Pakistani staff is performing up to sufficient status or like that, so they can be fairly knowledgeable. So it's still...
We're still building. We are still building, if that's
How many
what you're
eventually would you like to have?
I would think we want to move up to 16 or 24, something like that, between the American and the Pakistani staff over time.
So it basically, by the time we're in our last year of this Kerry Lugar Berman money, you'll be getting up to what point we want to be.
I think we can move much faster. We're trying to do this year and next fiscal year.
All right, so you're going to do a half a dozen more this year, but then maybe double it up in the next year.
That's what we ought to be doing. I mean, just in that case. But in terms of project office and others, I think we have to face the reality, and you are aware of this, Mr. Chairman, that after 7 or 8 years of working in these highly risky conflict zones, where usually they are officers unaccompanied by their families or spouses. It's taken its toll on the agency, and that's why we appreciate the support for the DLI program, the Development Leadership Program. Those people do have to be brought in, trained up, and then assigned to some of these more challenging posts. That will take time. And that's why we're moving to expand the number of mid-career development professionals we're bringing into the Development Leadership Initiative. And we're also now recruiting outside to bring people in under what we call Foreign Service Limited hire, which are Foreign Service officers, but they're limited to 5-year appointments at a time. It can be renewed once. So it's a technique we've developed in Afghanistan, and we started in Iraq. I was also the Deputy Assistant Administrator for Iraq for 2 years.
Are these people experienced in particular areas that you're going off for these 5-year periods?
We look for people who've had conflict zone experience. We've looked for, generally our requirements are pretty stiff. We look for a master's degree, if we can, plus 8 years experience, of which 4 has to be in conflict zones. When we can't get that, we then ask for 8 years, even more years of work experience, and then we do, of course, personal references on all of them. Right. But I guess the other thing I would just want to say here is that in terms of training them, this also takes time, and it's a difficult thing to do in the conflict setting, which is why we try to find people who've already got some of this experience to bring into the.
Have any success in bringing back former USAID personnel?
We have. We've reached out to former senior Foreign Service and regular Foreign Service officers, and with the help of Congress, we have special provisions to bring a limited number of officers back who can be sworn in again and retain their annuity as well. So in terms of certain authorities that would be helpful to us, Congress has been forward-leaning on that. We can bring certain personal service contractors on board as well as Foreign Service Limited officers. I think the time will come, though, when we need to find ways to how to retain these officers in these posts that are both dangerous and they're away from their families. What are the motivations to keep them there a second year or even a third year? For example, can we relocate families closer by in that theater, which is what was done in the Vietnam War, so that both military and civilian officers, in fact, would stay longer? Are there other financial incentives that potentially could be provided or caps lifted on the pay that they can earn? These are just a couple of simple examples that we really need to be looking at to retain the officers once they get there. They will be 4 times more effective in their second year than they are in their first year.
Do you have someone in your office that you could delegate to deal with Mr. Flake's staff and our staff here to maybe talk through some of those issues with more detail?
Would be happy to, absolutely.
Well, the staff director, Mr. Wright, will contact you and follow up on that.
I'll just add that we have done something unique in AID's history in the last 6 months, both for Afghanistan and Pakistan. recognizing the challenge to get senior officers of the current Corps to come to post, we have designated all the office director positions, of which there are approximately 10 in both posts, as what we call senior management group officers. And that means the administrator personally approves who goes there, and they have to be what we call FS1, Class 1 officers at a minimum, or senior foreign service officers to go. So normally those designations are required only for mission directors or deputy mission directors. So we have stepped up to the plate here and stepped up the internal incentives for our officers to serve there.
Go ahead, ask your question, Jeff.
Chairman, may I just say, in addition to that, that the number of direct hires, I believe, throughout Pakistan have increased 70% from 2008. I think it's gone from 336 to 580, with plans to add another 125 by 2011. So we also are closely monitoring the staffing situation, trying to get the best people out there as quickly as possible, and would be happy to join any sort of briefing on those issues.
Thank you.
I was just going to ask, how many, can you give us a ballpark number on how many you've been able to bring back, the foreign service officers, through this program?
I'm going to have to give that to you separately, but I can tell you I spend a part of every day calling colleagues who used to work for AID, seeing if we can attract them back. And they are serving in Iraq, they're serving in Afghanistan, they're serving in Pakistan. For example, our deputy director who's in Peshawar is a rehired senior foreign service officer, one that we are currently trying to bring to Karachi will be a rehired senior foreign service officer. We also have looked to other missions to loan their mission directors or their deputies to Pakistan, and we've brought 3 other mission directors out to Pakistan to help us over the past fall and winter. So we are doing everything we can to bolster the senior level of the mission.
Thank you. Does any other member wish to ask an additional question? Mr. Lynch.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, just to illuminate the problem we're having in attracting former or retired members, federal employees, up until about 6 months ago, we could not get federal, very highly skilled federal employees to come back to work for the government because they would have to, under the law, they would have to forfeit their annuity. Now, the corporate world has this right where if they have a special problem, they just pull people back in out of retirement to go to work for them. That person has no learning curve. They know the business as well as anyone. But we in government prevented some of our most skilled foreign service officers to come back into government because we would require them to forfeit their retirement. About 8 months ago, Senator Cocker and I got together. We changed that in the Defense Authorization Bill, but only for the last 6 months have we started to reach out to former federal employees who, these are highly skilled folks that have 20, 30 years experience, but it's only been the last 6 months that we've been able to bring folks back. One of the things I wanted to raise with you, sir, is that I think we only allow them to come back for 2 to 3 years, and then that expires. And I'm just asking, you're talking about a 5-year, these special contracts. We might have to amend that to 5 years in order to get them to come back under your program. So maybe that's something that we could work together. I happen to chair the Subcommittee on Federal Employees, so maybe that's something we could work on.
We would welcome working with the committee, yourself, sir, and others on this. I'm not aware of that particular limitation, but if it is there, I'd have to check the legislation again, and then we could extend it. That would be helpful. I will just toss one suggestion out. Under our, this is not Pakistan, but it's really Afghanistan related and Iraq related up to a certain point. Our brave soldiers that serve in wartime, in war theater, are exempt from federal tax during the time that they're there, as I understand it. Also, our grantees and our grantees and our contractors who are there under our pay are exempt from the first certain amount of their income on federal income tax, so they have to pay some on certain benefit kinds of packages. I think it's $75,000 or $90,000. The only Americans in harm's way who do not receive that financial incentive to serve and continue to serve are U.S. government civil servants and foreign service officers who are in harm's way in these war theaters. So I will just toss that out as something to think about, whether there is a way for those officers who are in harm's way in the same places where all other Americans who are there receive some benefit as a representation of the risks they're taking, might be able to benefit from this in the future, is the kind of thing that I think will help both attract and retain officers in the field.
I totally agree with you. You know, we have, especially in Afghanistan and in Iraq, where we have agricultural department employees in there. We got, you know, a lot of civilian employees in there, and they're not being treated nearly the same way in benefits, or even when they get injured in a war zone. There's a whole different way of treating them. I don't know if looks like I might have another minute left. What's that? Minute and 8 seconds. Minute and 8 seconds. Can you just give me a real thumbnail on Swat Valley? Because I know that we're pouring a lot of money in there. I had a chance to chat with Ambassador Patterson a few weeks ago, and that's sort of a microcosm of our effort there in Pakistan in terms of pushing the capacity of the government out into some of these tribal areas. Could you just give me a thumbnail on that?
I can give you my own historic perspective. When I lived there, I used to go fishing for trout in Swat Valley. It was that safe, and it was a beautiful tourist area. Now, of course, it's a different situation, and I, too, was alarmed, as Dan said earlier in our testimony, at how close the extremist elements were to Islamabad, and that resonated throughout the country. Today, we're working very closely with the Pakistan government and the Northwest Frontier government, as well as with General Nadim and First Corps and others, and with Pakistani institutions, Parsa among them, to assist in the Northwest Frontier, especially Mangor and Swat, with everything from reconstruction of those facilities that were damaged, but more importantly, building back, actually increasing the presence of the Pakistan civilian government. Where they used to have one administrative center that may have been blown up by the Taliban when they left, there will be 2 or 3 administrative centers. Where there was one police building, there'll be 2 or 3. Where there was one clinic, there'll be 2 or 3. And those are ways to deepen the governance service delivery. And the Pakistan civil service are returning to the area and working. So we've spent quite a few $100 million there, $350 to $400 million in relief efforts and reconstruction. There'll be more to come.
Thank you for your indulgence,
Thank you very
Mr.
much.
Chairman.
Any other member wishing to ask additional questions? There being none, let me leave this last question with you, gentlemen. Can you tell us how much of President Bush's $750 million program for Fatah has actually been obligated to spend in that region?
I don't have that information off the top of it, but we'd be happy to.
Could you give us a status
offer it to
report
you?
on
Sure.
that, on how much
course.
has been spent, how much has been obligated, and how much remains out there, and why it still remains
Sure, we'll take that
unspent,
back.
and what its plans may
Yeah,
be?
we'll get back to you on that.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Flake. Thank witnesses very much for your testimony, both written and oral, and your time, and your staffs as well. We appreciate it. We look forward to dealing with you in the future, and we'll definitely ask Mr. Alexander, Mr. Wright from the committee staff here to talk with Mr. Beaver about some of those incentives, as well as the tax situation that he brought up.
Great.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
This meeting is adjourned.